time. But today I'm going to start off just to kind of give everyone a heads up what the plan is. So I'm going to start off just giving a little introduction about myself, give a little bit of an introduction to identity, maybe a little bit about what Auth0 does, and then for the last part, which is going to be the majority chunk of my talk today, is going to be setting up Auth0 in a React app. And it's going to be hands-on. So if you have your computer in a spot that you can download the code and get something running, I suggest you have that, because it's going to be really easy to do what I'm doing today. And I hope that you're able to follow along with me. We have some material broken down and in branches on a repo that's easily installed and to work through. So yeah, hopefully everyone can participate. You don't need your camera or microphone or anything for that. That should be fun for everybody to walk through it with me as I try the live code in front of you all and pray that everything works. The demo works as we go through each step. So cool. Before I start with the workshop part, I just want to give a quick overview of like identity and some topics that we're going to be talking about and going over. First thing, my name is Tyler Clark, developer advocate engineer at Auth0 with Jess. You can find me on Twitter. I am Tyler W. Clark, and we got some courses on Egghead.io. If you have a subscription to Egghead, and then also some free stuff there, so you can find some of my work on that site if you're interested. It's just egghead.io. I do have some identity topics and videos there, as well as on our Auth0 YouTube playlist. So you can find me on some stuff, some videos that I have there as well. All right, how many of us feel like this kid when it comes to authentication? Because I definitely do. Before I started at Auth0, I used to work for a large enterprise company that went public when I was there. And for their identity solution, they just had a team that managed it all. And each individual team would just call an endpoint within our team, and they would handle that user's information and then respond back to us with their user information. And so we had a dedicated team that handled the identity part of the enterprise app. And so I never really touched it, and I never really got involved with the identity part of the app that I was working on. And so when I was interested in Auth0, it's still a new topic, even for myself, even though I've been at Auth0 for about a year and a half. It's still a new thing because it's such a complex world, and when it comes to identity, there's so many things that you need to know and understand in order to really grasp the concept of setting up identity within your application. And that's why businesses like Auth0 are so successful. And as we will see today, that it really takes out all of the difficult parts of setting up identity inside of your application. You can definitely do it yourself. There's just a lot that you need to do in order to constantly make sure your applications are secure and protected so that you don't have any leaks or any compromises with your information. And so the goal today is to talk about some topics within the identity space briefly, to kind of introduce you to some terminology that I will be going over in the workshop. And then hopefully by the end of it, you have a working React Auth0 application that you can show off to your friends at work or family. So as I said, let's talk about some buzzwords first. There's a lot of them, especially in the identity world. And today, to keep things brief, I'm only going to talk about these first three. Talk about what digital identity is, kind of explain what authentication and what authorization are. Because those are the two main topics that get answered or get asked to me. And those are the ones that will be answered today with the workshop that I'm going to go over. So let's talk about digital identity. So when you think of a digital identity of somebody, what you're thinking of is attributes of a person that are in the context of a specific application. So if you think about like an e-commerce website, and you create an account with an e-commerce website that sells purses, you're going to give them probably your name, your address, so they can ship stuff to you. You might save a credit card to your file. You might have to give your date of birth, zip code as part of your address, and just a lot of other little preferences. Maybe you select that you like, I don't know, white versus a green one or something like that. Each one of those attributes that you give to that application defines your own digital identity. And every one of us that has this account within applications, we are all making up our digital identity within them. Now, the goal of authentication and authorization and identity in general is to protect someone's digital identity, because in the wrong hands, this could be very destructive, especially with losing your identity to somebody else and having them take that on and use your information to buy, sell, and do things illegally. And this is where the two main topics or two main buzzwords that I want to talk about come into play: authentication and authorization. So authentication is the process of figuring out who a user is that accesses your application. So this is going to be typically the login form on a website. So the login form has username and password, and or email and password. Maybe it's you use a social connection like Google or GitHub. That login form represents authentication on a website, because in order to figure out who is accessing your site, you need to receive some credentials or factors from that user in order to determine who they are. The second part that goes hand in hand with that is, once you figure out who they are by their successful credentials and or factors, the second part is figuring out what that person has access to, and that is authorization. So again, we have authentication, which is figuring out who our user is, and we have authorization, which is figuring out what a user has access to. Now, authorization is the process, it typically works with an API level of things, right? When you're sending resources to an application, you only want to send the appropriate resources, and you determine that by sets of rules and policies that you've set up within your app that define what a user has access to and what they can and can't do with their account. So think of it, it could be a role or permissions, just like you think about an admin versus a super admin on an application. You first have them sign in to their account, which is the authentication part. But now that you've figured out that they're a super admin or an admin, you can limit what you show, what settings you show to those users by the use of authorization, which is kind of the second part. And so we're going to set up both of these in a React application using Auth0. We're going to set up authentication by adding a Auth0 login form that's going to ask for a user's email and password. And then we're going to protect resources by setting up an express server that deals with the authorization that somebody has access to. And so that's going to lead us to the workshop part. Now I'm going to drop some links into the Hackamba Content Hackathon channel in Discord. I really challenge everyone, if they are able to follow along and try to set this up yourself. You will need a Auth0 account. So go ahead and go to auth0.com and sign up for a free trial account. You don't need a credit card to sign up. So go ahead and head over to Auth0 when you have a chance to do that. I've already signed in to my Auth0 account, and I'll be working inside of here. So head over to auth0.com, create an account if you don't have one, sign up here, and get that going so that you can follow along if you don't already have one. And you'll notice that in our channel, I did post a link here. To the workshop material that I'm going to be going over. So I'll give everyone just a second to, first of all, set up a set up their Auth0 account, and then go ahead and clone this repo that we have. So let's go to code and download it to your local machine. So while you're doing that, again, two things to be working on right now. Create an Auth0 account if you don't have one. And second thing is to clone this repo that I put into the channel. You can start off on the main branch, but within this workshop, there are, I think, 7 steps. And with each step, that is on a branch. So the main branch is going to be the entire application put together. So if you are interested in jumping to the end and not having to do the work yourself, feel free, though I don't think you'll learn as much if you walk through it with me. But with each step, you can start off. Step 1 is going to have nothing on it. Step 2 is the completed version of step 1. So if you want to kind of skip along with me as I go, feel free to get checkout to the appropriate branch. For my example here, I'll show you I am starting on step 1 branch. So let me make this a little bigger. So yeah, I'm starting with nothing here, and I'm going to walk through each step individually on step 1 so that when I'm done with everything, my step 1 branch that I have locally should look the same as main does right now. Cool. All right, so hopefully you have this cloned downloaded to your computer and you have an Auth0 account set up already. And what we're going to be walking through is actually really, if you want to dive deeper into this later on, you definitely can. I'm basically going to be following this article that we have. Let me drop that into our channel so you can follow along. If you are going through this with myself, oh, I pasted the same one twice. Oh, this is not what I thought. There we go. I'm going to be, let me delete my last message in here. So yeah, I'm going to be following along with this blog article. So feel free to pull it up as well, because I'm basically walking through this step by step. And this is going to give us way more information, and it's going to be some good notes for all of us to follow. All right, cool. So let's get started. Once you clone this repo, I'm on branch step 1. Once you clone this repo, make sure you install the dependencies. Clone the repo, check out the step 1 here. You'll need to install your packages on the front end branch. Let me open up so this is the repository as it looks on the first branch. You have a backend folder. So this is where we'll set up our Express backend, and we will create a couple routes actually, a protected routes that will check a user's authorization, and a public one that anyone would be able to hit. But that's going to be, I think that's like we don't get to that until like step 6 or step 5. So we're going to be starting on the front end folder first and setting up authentication with Auth0 and React. So I'm going to be working inside this front end option here, but make sure you have node modules both in backend and front end. So do an npm install on both the front end and backend folders, so you have that. And once you're in a good spot, cd into your front end folder, as that's what we're going to be working on first, and run a npm start. So that's going to start it off in port 4040. You can see that this is a Create React app, so pretty basic starting points that all of us are probably pretty familiar with. All right, cool. Let's get started here. So the first thing is, clone this all, check out step 1, and for step 2, this is going to be the step 2 branch, meaning that everything in step 1 is done. We're going to connect React with Auth0. The way that we're going to do that, just follow along, leave. Scroll down to this. First step is to do a little bit of setup in our Auth0 account. So once you're into your Auth0 account, you'll notice that on the left here, we have a sidebar with a lot of quick links. We need to go to Applications and Applications. On the purple button on the side here, let's create an application. And then because we're working with React, it's going to be a JavaScript front-end app. So let's go ahead and name this Auth0 React Sample. Once we get into this, the first tab that we see here is the Quick Start tab. That's going to show us Angular, JavaScript, React, Vue. There's also other ones you can search for. We don't need to do anything because we've already set that up with this repo. Excuse me. So just go ahead and click over to Settings because we need to do some stuff inside of this page to configure it for our app. All right, so the first thing we need to do is add the URLs that we're going to be working with our app. So this is just the client. So this is the local host that we're working on right now. If you move this app to production, you'll need to use real domains. But inside of this page, we need to scroll down to 3 different fields here. We need to add the localhost to the allowed callback URLs, allowed logout URLs, and allowed web origins. So in an attempt for Auth0 to be as secure as possible and to protect apps as much as we can, we will only allow it to work, have users authenticate on protected URLs and also to log out on protected URLs. And then again, an attempt to make this as secure as possible, we'll add our localhost to our localhost URL to these 3 boxes. So log out, callback, and allowed web origin. Once we have those 3 in there, scroll on down to save changes. Now there's a lot of other configurations that you can make to your tokens, to both ID and access and whatever you want to do here, especially updating application logos and that kind of thing. But for the simplicity's sake, we're going to leave everything default and just do the bare minimum that we can. So once you've added that to those 3 sections, we save it. Next thing we're going to do is create a Dot Env folder within our app code. So this is saying to use touch. I'm just working in VS Code, so I'm going to do that inside VS Code. So inside of our front end here, you'll see that we have a .env.example. So I'm just going to rename this to .env. And notice that we already have this set up in here for us. We have the Auth0 domain and client ID. So this is how we're going to specify this localhost running app with the application that we just created in our Auth0 dashboard. So inside of our Auth0 dashboard, let's grab at the top here the domain and client ID. So I'm going to grab that domain by copying, add it here for domain, client ID. Perfect. So again, this is in your env folder. This is an environment file that gets loaded whenever you run your application. And you don't commit this folder or this file to your repo if you're going to save this, as this is a way of saving secrets without it being public to everyone. So this is a .env file that is going to be added to, that is in the git ignore, so that you're committing it. Perfect. And I believe, okay, so you go to domain, we already talked about that. All right, I think that's it for step 2. Yep, so that's it for step 2. Step 2 was just creating your Auth0, doing some configurations inside of your Auth0 dashboard, creating an application, and then transferring some config variables over to the React app, as well as adding the URL that we're going to be working with, so we know we're telling Auth0 to work. Step 3, we're going to set up the Auth0 React SDK. So this is where we need to install a particular package that Auth0 has created from their SDK team. So head over to your terminal and install the Auth0/Auth0-React SDK. Now, this package came out this year, I want to say, or last year. It's before this. There was a universal JavaScript package that's still out there, and we have SDK teams that work on many different programming languages in an attempt to make it as universal as possible. I'm most familiar with the React app and the React app SDK package, and I highly recommend it for any React applications, as it will make your life more. It will make your life way easier. And I will be checking our channel every now and then just to make sure. If you have any questions, you need me to slow down, or you want me to talk about something, please throw it in there, and I will try my best to check it periodically and answer any questions. So throw them in there at any time. Happy to pause and answer those. Cool. So we have the SDK added in there. So now let's rerun this with the React SDK. And now the next thing we're going to do is add that page. Next thing we're going to do is add a Auth0 provider component. Now, if you're familiar with React, you're probably familiar with the idea of context and how React applications can work through context in order to pull values into any component at any level, as long as the parent component is wrapped with a context component. And so what we're doing with the Auth0 React SDK is at the very top level of our app, we're going to wrap it in a Auth0 provider component so that anywhere within our app, as small as the lowliest component, you'll be able to pull in values and functions that the Auth0 React SDK is going to provide to you without having to install or reset up that SDK multiple times. You can just do it one time and then grab any values or functions that you need. So we're going to wrap a Auth0 provider component around our app. So the first thing we're going to do is create this. So inside of source, let's make a folder called auth. So inside source, let's do a new folder. We'll call this an auth. And then we're going to create a file called Auth0 provider with history.as. This. So source auth, that file there. And then we already have the code written out for us. So I'm going to copy this over, and we're going to talk about what this is doing. Great. So just starting at the top, we're obviously importing React, because this is a React app, pretty self-explanatory. But then these next two things, we're going to be using React Router DOM, because this project is built with React Router. And we're going to import the Auth0 provider component from our React SDK. Now, inside of this Auth0 provider with history component, we are going to need to grab those two values that we added to our env file, the domain and client ID. So those are being referenced here to grab out that domain and client. So you can see this process.env is referencing those. Now, history is a way of controlling the history that the browser is going to remember as we navigate within our application. And then this is the provider element or component that we got from the SDK. So we're passing it some config options as props. We give it the domain, we give it the client ID, we give it the redirect URI, so where to redirect after someone logs out. This is going to be the default option. This is just saying go back to the origin, which is localhost 4040. And then the onRedirect callback is this function, as I mentioned before, with the history from React Router. Now, with that all put together, we need to actually import this into our app. So let's see, did I pass that? Oh, it's right here. Now we're going to our source index page, which is the root of our application. Notice how we wrap it with router and app, but we're going to wrap app with our Auth0 provider with history component that we just set up. We need to import this. Yeah. Perfect. So again, this provider lives inside of our auth folder, and it's initiating our React SDK with the default values referencing the application that we just created in our Auth0 dashboard. And then this is going to provide the ability for us to access values and functions like logging in, logging out from the Auth0 React SDK. Now, with that in there, let's restart our app so that we have that working. And then I believe that is it for step 3. Now, step 4, we're going to add the user authentication. Make sure our app is still running, and it is. Perfect. So we didn't break anything just yet, but we've set up the foundation to have Auth0 authentication working inside of our app. All right, let's go to adding user authentication. Now we need to create a login button, a sign up button, and a log out button, calling Auth0's some built-in Auth0 functions like logging in and logging out. So inside of components, let's make a file called login-button.js. So we'll go to components, new file, add a login button. Then we're going to throw in some login button React code. Okay, so again, bring in React. We're going to bring in the use Auth0 hook from our React SDK, because we're going to pull off a function. So I've said this multiple times now, but because we have that provider element wrapping our entire app, we have access to use this hook that's going to reference the context that we've set up and pull off functions and values. One of those functions being login with redirect, and you'll see that it also pulls out a logout function from this same use Auth0 hook. So we have a simple button with a class name, and on click of that button, it's going to log in the user with a redirect. Now, as a reference for you all, if you're interested, you can also create a separate sign up button. So if you notice on the Auth0 main page, we have a login button as well as a sign up button. And you can create those to be different things. So for sign up, it automatically sends a user to the sign up part of the login page with that being active, or you can send them to the same login page, however, having the login option automatically active for the users. So if you're interested and you want some extra credit, you can go ahead and move to the create a sign up button, which is going to be just its own separate file, and it does the exact same thing except for instead of just login with redirect as is, like this, it's being passed a config object with screen hit sign up. This is how you can differentiate and tell the login that you want it to show the sign up versus the login. And in order to get that to work, you do need to be on the universal login. So that's going to be logging into your dashboard and selecting the new universal login versus the classic one. All right, so let's create the login button now. So we have the login. Now let's create the logout. So inside of components, we'll do a logout button. Import this code. Now you notice that this is basically the same thing, except we're pulling a logout function on our use Auth0 hook and applying that function to our onClick with a return to location. So again, in the provider, let's go back to that. We put a redirect URI with telling it to just go back to the root domain. But if you wanted to override that and have a special case with each logout, you can do that here. So you can tell it where to log out. Okay. Perfect. So I think that is nope, that's not the end of step 4. So now we have a login and logout button. Let's actually add that. So we're going to create a kind of parent component that will control switching between showing the message login or logout. So inside components, we'll kind of bring those together in a file called Authentication Button.js. We will import those two buttons that we just made. And notice the ternary that we have here. So we're going to pull off this Boolean value from our use Auth0 React SDK hook. That's going to tell us if a user is currently authenticated on our website. If they are, then show the logout button. If they're not, then show the login button. Okay, so now let's build an auth-nav.js instead of our components. And we will add this information here, which is just our authentication button, the switcher that we had, that we just created. We're going to add this instead of a navbar container with some navbar classes on it. Now let's go to our navbar. So our site currently has kind of a navbar that shows profile, an external API, and just the home page. But it would be nice if we could add our login, logout button switcher thing here to the top. So instead of here, let's just bring in the auth nav component that we've just created instead of our navbar. That, and then just underneath main nav, let's add auth nav. And then see what that looks like. Perfect. So we'll see how quick that loaded here. We now have a login button. And I'm not logged in, so it's showing login versus logout. And as soon as I authenticate and add a user account to this, I'm going to automatically, it's going to automatically switch to say logout. So let's try it out. So I've already created an account with a fake email. It says it's just tyler2@gmail.com. But if it's the first time that you are accessing a site, accessing a Auth0 application, you will need to sign up. So click on the sign up button. But like I said, I've already set up an account within my own Auth0 account for Tyler2. Go ahead and log in with that. Okay. Now, because this is a new application that we've just created with Auth0, it's going to ask for our consent for the app that we're currently working on to access some information about myself, specifically my profile and email. So on our app that we're created, if you notice, there was a profile page where ideally we want to display a user's profile and their email. And so in order to have Auth0 work with the localhost app that we're creating, we want Auth0 asking for my consent to send that to the app that I'm logging into. So I'm going to accept, and that's going to send me back to my origin value here, the localhost, with now a logout button. So now I'm a successfully authenticated user inside of this React app. So now that might seem like a lot. I have been talking for probably 30-ish minutes, and it might seem like we did a lot of steps there, but really it wasn't. And that was all that we needed to do. So we, just to kind of recap for the authentication piece, what did we do? We created an Auth0 account. We have a React app. Could be create React app, or just a React app with React router, something like that. And then we created an application instead of our Auth0 dashboard, grabbed some values out of it, added some URLs that our app's going to be loading on, and then we just created a login, logout button that accesses the Auth0 React SDK and utilizes some methods and values from it, like logging in, logging out, and checking to see if a user is authenticated or not. And all those steps probably 8 to 10 steps, is all you need to add a authentication feature to your website. And that login form is being redirected to Auth0 servers in order to protect the user from any kind of breaches. You're not hosting that on your own site, so you mitigate any risk of any security concerns that you might have. All that's being handled by Auth0. And you can get away with this with just a free account. Now, as your application grows, you get more users. There's some pricing that comes involved with that. But with just getting up and running, you can see how simple it is to add an authentication service to your app. And once people log in, if you go to your dashboard, you can manage those users. So you have all the users in here that are within my own tenant. You can define roles like admins, teachers, and assign them to those users. Now, Auth0 manages all the users that you create with it. We're not going to get into it today, but if you notice, there was a Google social login on that universal login page. It's so easy to add other social connections using Auth0. So the Google one kind of shows at the bottom, but there are some setup steps you need to do in order for it to work with your first application. But you can easily add GitHub, Facebook, Microsoft, really a lot of options that you can use as a social connection to have users authenticate with your app and continue to use with mostly a click of a button and then some additional configuration steps involved. Sweet. So now that we have completed user authentication, let's now work with the user that has authenticated. So in this example, myself, let's work with that user information that I've given it. So we're going to move on to step 5. Oh, but first, actually, let's improve the UX a little bit of our app. So an additional value that you can get from Auth0's SDK is the isLoading option. So let's go to our source app.js and bring in that hook. We're going to bring in our Auth0 hook, and then let's pull out this. Or basically, we're saying, is our application loading? Is it trying to authenticate a user? If it is, then return a loading component that is already built within this app. Let's make sure we import loading from our components file. This is just a spinny SVG loading component. So is loading basically, is our user authenticating, or are we checking our Auth0 user information behind the scenes? If you are, then let's show the loading spinner here, like that, the loading spinner. If not, then we can return displaying our app. All right, so let's retrieve user information here. So now that a user, myself, is authenticated on the site, let's show some information. Notice on the we have a profile page, but it doesn't show anything. So let's actually show something on it. I'm going to navigate to that page, the profile page. And we're going to use some user information. So let's do that. Grabbing that use Auth0 hook, pulling out the user from it, and then I'm going to pull out my user's name, picture, and email of that user. Now we can display this within our app. Let me actually just copy this whole file because it does it all for us. We're now going to use an image that shows my profile picture, if there is one. I'm going to show my name as an H2, and it's going to stringify the rest of my user information here, so we can kind of see what that looks like. So now, if I go to my app, look, we have my profile image for that user, which is just a favicon icon. There's no image attached to it. My email address, the fake one that I've set up, and then a JSON stringified of the user object. You can see my nickname that I have in here, my name that I've defined for my account, the email that I use, and then this is my Auth0 sub, which represents the ID of my user, as you can find in the backend. So you can use this information to add information to your own backend, your own database for your own references. But this is accessing the ID token of the user that it just authenticated. Now, ID tokens, in this case, is a JOT, which means that it has a key value pair of information like nickname and Tyler. This is what's called a claim that lives on the ID token, the JOT. And I'm pulling this information off of the ID token. Now, whenever you authenticate, you're going to receive two tokens. One of them is ID token, and one of them is an access token. What we're working with right here is an ID token, which defines the user, their ID, and their information. You can add custom claims to this inside of your Auth0 dashboard to extend what you work with on that user, whether it be things like address or what else could you add? Phone number. You can add that to a user's ID token, and that can be passed around between your application. All right, now let's see, was that the end of that step? Yep, that's it for step 5. Now on to step 6 and 7. So this is where we're going to start digging into a backend element of our app. So now we're going to protect a route, which basically means that we don't want to load the profile route unless they've actually logged in or they've actually authenticated, because there's no point of showing that page if we don't know who they are and we don't have an ID token to show. So let's go ahead and protect this route. And you'll see how this is important for working with step 7, which is setting up and calling an API. So the Auth0 React SDK does give us a function called with authentication required. So in our profile page, let's also pull off this with authentication required. Now, what this is doing, it's a higher order component. You can wrap your profile component with it, which basically tells that you can't access the profile page unless they're authenticated. So this is doing some behind the scenes work with lifecycle methods and basically checking to make sure that this is an authenticated user before it loads it. So this is a very easy way of protecting pages based on them being authenticated or not. And while it's figuring that out or redirecting, we can add another component to display on the page. So in our case, let's just show the loading element while we're trying to figure out if they're authenticated or not. Let's see. I got a question in the chat. One, apologies, my front-end skills are sucks. My area of strength is back-end. Can Auth0 be used on the server side too, or just client? Great question, and it can be used on the server side. Now, whether you're working with Node or C# or Java, we do have SDKs in all of those languages, all of which can be found online instead of our Auth0 documentation. But yes, lots of extensive work on back-end languages as well. Now, that's going to, if you're using like Razor for C# pages or something, all that stuff can be handled with SDKs that we've set up. Great question. In this example, it is obviously being set up with just React as a single-page web app. We are going to use Express a little bit, but that is not for the authentication part. That's for the authorization part, determining what a user has access to. While I reload the page, and notice the user is logged out automatically. How do you preserve the login user state? Great question. That happens with the, do you remember back inside of our, where is it at? Okay, inside of your dashboard, you need to make sure that you have added, you need to make sure that you've added your URL, whatever it is, and it's correct. Make sure you've added it to the allowed web origins. This is going to be the magic to make sure that when you reload the page, that the user stays signed in. Without it there, it'll make a user sign in every single time. something that I learned the hard way when I first got introduced into Auth0 by not putting this value here. Make sure your URL is correct. Don't have a trailing slash at the end. Just have it be like this. But Auth0 does a lot of work behind the scenes that I'm not even touching on. One of those things is silent auth, meaning that we don't want our users to constantly re-sign in every time they reload the page. And so Auth0 behind the scenes is going to make sure that the user is, if they have a valid access token that lives in the background of your browser, if it's still valid, it will automatically sign them on page refresh, making sure that you don't have to restart that or make your user sign in every time. Let me fix this loading here, and then I'll show you. So we need to import loading from components. Okay, so we'll fix our error. So great. As I refresh this page, notice that it's still showing log out, right? It's not asking us if to re-sign in. This page is now protected too. So if I log out and then try to hit profile, notice that it instantly kicked me into the universal login. So that's showing that our with authentication required is needed. Once I sign in, I can now access that profile page, and it will keep me signed in as long as my access token is valid and I haven't clicked the log out button. Cool. Now that is one way of doing it here. The with authentication required, but if you're working with like React Router, there's a better way of showing which of your routes are protected, right? Because with React Router, let's go to our page. This is our app component. You can see perfect. So with our React Router component here, you can see that we have our routes defined here. We have the home page, the profile, and external API page. Now these, as you can't tell by looking here which one's protected. Now we know that profile is protected, right? Because we just added it. But ideally, we want also external API to be protected because there's no point in calling the API unless we know who the user is. So we could go into the external API component and wrap it with authentication required, or there's a better way where we can kind of create a protected route component that utilizes that and makes it more specific here, so everyone reading our code will be able to see it. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's create inside of our auth a protected route.js file. And then in here, we're going to move that with authentication required function into here. So we're going to create a protected route component that's going to use the route component from React Router. And notice that we bring in the with authentication require, that function, and that's going to basically just wrap our component that gets passed through props to our route component. So we can remove it from our profile, and instead move this and that function, okay? And so now that we have it here, now inside of our app, we can bring in this protected route. And then we can use protected route, that component, that we can use that for both our profile and external API component. Basically switching out route with protected route. Now profile and external API can no longer be accessed unless you are authenticated. So let's just refresh this. Notice that it works there. And then external API, it works as well. Now if I log out, go to external API, kicks me over to sign in. So we've successfully protected those two pages by very minimum amount of code. All we're using is the with authentication required function that came from the SDK. So on the front end, we've made it super, super simple. We have a question, how long is the access token valid for? Great question. So all that information you can define inside of your application that you created inside of your Auth0. Now you can see here, you can set the lifetime of your ID token in seconds. And there's also information about refreshing your tokens by doing a refresh token rotation. Well, that's a topic for another day. But you can define that information here inside of your Auth0 application. Great question. All right, let's check to see if that is the it for that step. Yep, make sure you remove profile. Yep, that's it. So the last and final step is the API, external API. Notice how get public message right now is not making any network requests. So nothing's happening as I click on these two buttons, but we actually want to hit a API, and we want to have it respond with information regarding the access token that I have now that I've authenticated. Now, this is going to be in the backend folder of our code. So make sure you've installed your node modules there, and we're going to set up the endpoints inside of this page here of the backend. But before we do that, we do need to set up some more information inside of our Auth0 dashboard. Before, what we've done is created an application instead of Auth0 dashboard. Now we need to set up an API instead of our dashboard as well, and then grab some values from that, and then also connect it to our front end, so that we can tell Auth0 to keep that relationship, and that's a way of Auth0 making sure that relationship stays secure. So instead of Auth0, we're going to go to the API section. So on APIs, we're going to create a new API. Let's call it Auth0 Express Sample. We're going to set the identifier. This is how we can identify this API. As you can see here, it says, we recommend using a URL, but note that this doesn't have to be a publicly available URL. Auth0 will not call your API at all. This field cannot be modified. So this is a way of defining your API and giving it a specific identification. Press create. Okay. Now inside of that folder of the backend, we need to create a .env file. So we see that the example is already there for you. If you download this this repo that I have, and it gives us our server port, client origin URL, which is referencing the front end running React app on 4040. And we need to grab two values from here, the audience and the domain from our newly created API. Here. Now inside the settings tab of this API, we're looking for the identifier that we just wrote. So we're going to grab that identifier. This is the audience parameter that's used on authorization calls. So we're going to add audience here, which is just express.sample. And then we're going to grab, inside of test, we need to grab the domain, which you can find right here. All the way up to the .com. And add that to domain. So you'll recognize this as being the tenant name.auth0.com. Okay, and now with that running, I'm going to navigate to the backend folder on a separate terminal tab, and then npm start that one. Perfect. So you can see that our API server is now running on 6060. We have our front end running here. We have our API running on 6060. So now we need to go back to our front end and add some information. We need to tell our app the server URL, which was 6060. We also need to add that audience, that identifier that we created for our API. This is how we're going to tell how we tell Auth0 that the application that we've created needs to work with the API we've created in Auth0. This identifier is how that relationship connects. So back inside of our code, we're going to go to the front end env and add these two additional values. So express sample and localhost 6060. Save that file. We do also need to, let's first with those new env files, let's restart our React app here. We'll reload this page. But with that audience that we've added to the env on the front end, we do need to update the audience here of our Auth0 provider. Remember the provider that wraps the front end main app? We do need to update this guy with that audience that we've just created. So spell that right in audience, and we'll grab that from our env variable. That. So there's the audience identifier that we just created in our API. It's here, and we're passing it to the provider so that the provider that's setting up our SDK on the React side knows and tells the calls that we're going to make here which API we want it to work with. And that's going to be the API we created in our Auth0 dashboard. Okay, so now on the external API page, now we can actually make our calls to our backend. And we do need to set those routes up, which we'll do here in a moment. But let's go, close out all this, go to our internal API page, just switch all that out. Perfect. So let's look at the green and see what's changed. So now we're bringing in the use Auth0 hook. We want to display a message onto the page. So onto this page, we do want to display whatever message we get back from our Express API. Whatever we get when we click on Get Public Message and Protected Message, as you can see, we want to display what we get. So notice how we're getting these messages. We're saying this API for the public doesn't need a token. We'll get to that, but that message is how we differentiate the state there. Now, we talked about the ID token on a profile page that defines claims that tell us about the user that's authenticated, whether their name, their email address, that kind of stuff. Now, the second token is the access token, and the access token does exactly as it sounds. It defines the access of a user. So it's a token that we're sending to our Express backend, and the Express backend is going to verify that token, and if it is valid, it's going to respond or not. So when we get this access token, we can fetch our API here, and we will attach this to the header of our call. So if you work in JavaScript, you're probably familiar with fetch. You define the URL that you want to hit. You can define a config option that you can add additional things to the header. So in our case, in the authorization header, we're adding a string that says bearer, and then the access token that Auth0 generates for us when we authenticate a user. We're attaching that to the call. Now, the call secure API and the call the API. Notice how the call API is not attaching it on this public message endpoint, this route here. And we'll look at that code here once we move on here. But this does not need a token. And however, on this one, we are sending our access token. Once we get that response back from either one, we're going to update the message that gets displayed on the external API page. Okay. And that is it for that. But let's go look at the backend route. This one is protected message, or look at the public message one. Messages.router here. So this one, as you can see, is just an endpoint that is public here. And it gets a public message that has been defined right here within the backend file. And then it just responds with a 200 and that message. Now on the backend, you'll notice that we have the protected message route. This has a middleware called check.jot. Now the check.jot option here, this one is a package. There's two that are being utilized here from Auth0. There's the express.jot and the JWKS-RSA. These two packages work hand in hand with Express to verify access tokens that get sent to them. So this is some middleware that you can copy over. It's in that repo built for us. But this is going to validate the access token that we sent from the front end. So again, with the public one, doesn't have that middleware, but the protected route does have the check.jot middleware. And we've added an express middleware, check.jwt, and that is checking the access token based off of the packages that Auth0 has created for us here. And that's going to verify the token that it's getting. If it is successful, then it will respond with the API successfully validated your access token. Now, if we go back to our app, you'll notice that public works maybe it's because it's erring. Okay, it says that our API doesn't require an access token to share the message. And this one is a 500 error. And I believe it's because we've added the API to our app. So we do need a new access token for our account. So I believe if I log out and log back in here, I'm going to get a new access token. Let's see, what am I missing? Check our console.
Did you start the web server?
It's still running here. Forms. Maybe I need to restart them both. This is the beauty of live coding here. I will show though that I always skipped a step, but I'm not sure which one I skipped.
What's on port 443?
Nothing should be on that port. I will show though that our protected route call is sending along instead of the authentication headers. You'll notice that this is the string that we're sending along. So this is my token that I get, and we can actually copy that and go to jot.io. We can take a look at this access token. So this is corrected by us at Auth0. I can throw this into this little encoded paste token here, and you'll see my my payload. So this is the claims of my access token. You can see that it's broken down in 3 segments. There's the red, purple, and blue. This header shows the algorithm, the type that it is. The purple is the payload of my access token. It does show the audience in there, so that is correct. You can see scopes that I have. These are the default claims that come with your token. And then this last part is called the crypto section, and this is the signature of my token. So this is what's being sent to the backend to our Express API. Now let me go through this and see what I'm missing, because it's going to be here. And also figure this out after. Yeah, it is looking for 0.443.
So I see something on the Auth0 docs that says about running a reverse proxy from 443 to localhost.
Okay.
Let me share it with you. Did you use HTTPS anywhere instead of HTTP maybe?
I have done this without needing to do that, though. I'm sure something is just slightly misspelled, or well, I'm going to work on this right after this talk and then post it into the channel and see what I'm missing, because I'm sure it's pretty obvious. But does anyone have any questions? Ideally, that would have responded with the message, because you can see that I am sending the access token along. But does anybody have any questions for me about Auth0, setting this up? Feel free to throw it into the channel, or you can jump on and chat. Well, like I said, it looks like no one has any questions. I'm going to look at this a little bit more because I'm sure the answer is pretty obvious. But that's it for me. Thanks for having me on, and I will post whatever it is I'm missing into the chat after this.
Okay, cool. Thank you very much, Tyler. I think maybe everyone else is trying to find where it is as well, where the issue is maybe.